Hello and welcome to today's Social Housing and Human Rights webinar, Mobilizing Our Communities for Social Housing. My name is Shauna McKinnon and I'm a member of the Social Housing and Human Rights Organizing Committee. And we're so pleased that you have taken the time to join us today for this webinar. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are coming together from many different Indigenous territories and traditional ancestral lands. I am located in Winnipeg on Treaty 1 territory and on the homeland of the Métis. Also presenting today are Kirsten Burness and Catherine Lucier, also members of the organizing committee. The focus of the Social Housing and Human Rights Coalition, also known as SHHR, is to build public support for and advocate for more public investment in social housing across Canada. We know that in addition to strong regulation of the private housing market, social housing is needed if we are to move people out of poor housing need and ensure that homes are affordable to the lowest income households, including people experiencing homelessness. The purpose of today's webinar is to provide a brief overview of the SHHR campaign for those who are engaging with us for the first time, provide an analysis of the federal budget as it aligns with SHHR's campaign goals, to have some discussion with you about next steps, including how we can support you to mobilize at the local level to achieve our shared objectives. Today's webinar is 90 minutes. We're going to begin with a brief presentation, approximately 45 minutes, to set some context for our discussion. We're then going to break out into smaller groups for about 30 minutes, and we're going to try to do that by region so that we can determine what SHHR can do to support local advocacy through training and development of tools and templates to help us all in our work. We're going to then end with a very brief report back and discussion about next steps. We'll have everyone except for speakers muted, but the chat is open for you to ask questions, and we're going to do our best to answer them in real time. If there are any outstanding questions at the end of our 90 minutes, we will follow up with answers as soon as possible after the webinar. Okay, so what is SHHR? So I'm going to start with a very brief history and description of SHHR. We're a consortium of individuals and organizations committed to the expansion of social housing across Canada. We began our work in the fall of 2023 with support from the Manitoba Research Alliance and a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council connection grant. We began with the process of synthesizing existing knowledge and generating new knowledge to help us build the case for more public investment in social housing. We then brought researchers and activists together at an event at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights in Winnipeg to share our knowledge and stories of lived experience. We then began to organize and strategize. SHHR is a growing movement of people committed to a shift in public policy toward non-market social housing. SHHR is the only national housing advocacy organization singularly and unapologetically focused on advocating for an expansion of social housing, including non-market, public, nonprofit, and co-ops, with rents at less than 30% of income, also referred to as RGI, and with priority given to the lowest income renter households. There are other campaigns that call for more social housing, typically calling for a doubling of social housing, but they include both RGI and affordable rents. And I'm going to explain in a few minutes what that means. While SHHR agrees that other affordable housing is needed, we believe governments must prioritize investment in housing for the lowest income households, and that means social housing. So you might ask, what is the difference between social housing and affordable housing? So it's important to understand that social housing and affordable housing are not the same. Social housing is housing that exists outside of the market, so it cannot be used for speculation or to generate wealth, and that in most provinces and territories costs less than 30% of household income or equivalent to social assistance housing allowances. In Quebec, social housing costs less than 25% of the household income, and we believe strongly that this must be maintained. Social housing can be owned by public, nonprofit, or cooperative housing providers. It cannot be owned by private for-profit housing providers. Agreements between governments and the housing provider limit how the property can be used and provide subsidies to ensure that housing providers can offer rents that are geared to income, again, also known as RGI. Affordable housing is far more broadly defined. It can be private, for-profit owned, as well as public, nonprofit, and cooperative. Rents determined as affordable vary across programs and governments, and they don't align with the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation's definition of affordable housing. CMHC considers housing to be affordable if it costs less than 30% of household total income before taxes. So, for example, some programs define affordable rents as renting at 70 or 80% of median market rent. Others define rent as 30% of median family income. These rents are not affordable to the lowest income households. I encourage you to look very closely at how programs are defining affordability, because they are all too often not affordable to low-income households. Social housing advocates look at both affordability and core housing need to understand the housing situation of those in greatest need. So it's very important for us to understand what is meant by core housing need. We know from the latest census of 2021 that 5% of households are considered to be in core housing need. But the situation for renters is far worse. 20% of renter households are in core housing need, and an astounding 58.6% of renter households living in poverty are in core housing need. As mentioned, SHHR is focused on policy solutions that will expand the social housing supply to move people out of core housing need, and especially to provide homes affordable to the lowest income renter households, including people experiencing homelessness. CMHC deems a household to be in core housing need if its housing does not meet one or more of the adequacy, suitability, or affordability standards, and it would have to spend 30% or more of its before tax income to access acceptable local housing. Housing is considered acceptable if it does not need major repair, if it is suitable in size, so meets the national occupancy standards, and costs less than 30% of household income before tax. CMHC describes a two-step process to determine housing need that includes first determining whether a household lives in acceptable housing, and if it does not, then determining whether its before tax income is sufficient to access acceptable local housing. Determining core housing need is important because it can inform public policies that prioritize households in greatest need and gives us a sense of how many new units of social housing are needed. So I just want to spend a little brief time here on how we got to the situation that we're currently in. As a result of changes in federal policy, very few social housing units have been developed since 1993. And for more information on this history, I encourage you to refer to the Social Housing Primer on the Social Housing and Human Rights website, and Kaylee will provide a link to that in the chat. The National Housing Strategy was implemented in 2017. A central aim of the strategy was to, and I quote, set a long-term vision for housing focused on improving housing outcomes for those in greatest need. Central to the National Housing Strategy, as well as the National Housing Strategy Act, which followed in 2019, was the recognition that, and I quote, housing rights are human rights. The strategy aims to, and I quote, progressively implement the right of every Canadian to access adequate housing. To date, over $80 billion has been committed to the strategy, yet very little has led to the creation of rental units affordable to the lowest income households. For example, 25% of the National Housing Strategy has gone to the Apartment Construction Loan Program, which was previously called the Rental Construction Financing Program or Initiative, where a mere 3% of units produced are affordable to low-income households. Only 4% of the National Housing Strategy has gone to the Rapid Housing Initiative, and that's the only program that focuses on creating non-market social housing units at RGI rates for the lowest income renter households. That's 4% of the strategy. So this brings me to my final slide, and I'll pass things then over to Kirsten. The Social Housing and Human Rights Call to Action. After our initial meeting in Winnipeg in April 2023, SHHR participants came to consensus on 2 calls to action, and in November 2024, we launched our campaign around these calls to action. So as you can see on this slide, these include to create a minimum of 50,000 net new rent geared to income social housing units each year for 10 years, starting now. These units should be targeted for those experiencing core housing need and homelessness and have rents permanently set at no more than 30% of household income. Second, to invest in the acquisition, construction, operation, and maintenance of new and existing public, nonprofit, and cooperative-owned housing that meets the unique and varied requirements of people experiencing core housing need and homelessness. I should also say that Katie was going to put in the chat a link to our FAQ that explains how we came to the 50,000 target. So that's, I'm now going to pass things over to Kirsten Burness, who's going to provide an update on what SHHR has been up to since launching our campaign in November 2023.
Thanks, Shauna. Hi, everyone. So yeah, I'm going to chat about some highlights that the campaign has been up to over the last several months. So we officially launched the campaign in November of last year. But before that, in October, we were able to organize hundreds of participants who gathered in cities across Canada, calling on the federal government to invest in more social housing. So we held a day of action where we had different actions taking place in 7 cities, sort of as a warm-up to our launch. So that was really great. I think there's some photos on the slide reflecting some of those actions. And then, yeah, we officially launched in November. We gathered online for our launch, where we released our website that is now available, www.moresocialhousing.com. And we released our call to action, and that's when we really began to seek endorsements for our call to action. And since then, we've had over 330 individuals and organizations endorse our campaign. That includes the NDP caucus federally, and we've been meeting with other federal MPs to gather additional endorsements. But we do have quite a lot of endorsements from various organizations and individuals across the country, and are hoping to build on that. And then in the new year, January through the budget time and the federal budget time, we ran a bit of a campaign, a letter writing campaign, where we encouraged individuals to send a letter to federal cabinet ministers, encouraging them to implement our call to action in the federal budget. We provided to the federal government a formal budget submission and encouraged our supporters to draft their own submission using some of our language, so that we could send a consistent message around what we wanted to see in the budget for social housing. And then just recently, this month, the HUMA Committee, which is the House of Commons Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills and Social Development, and the Status of Persons with Disabilities, they announced that they were going to do a study on the role played by the lack of federal investments in previous years in purpose-built rental, affordable housing, social housing, rent geared to housing, co-op housing, the role that the lack of investments in those has played in creating the housing and homelessness crisis we see today in 10 cities in Canada. And so we, as a campaign, requested to speak to the committee, because they do take some presentations as part of their study. We didn't get the chance to speak, but we did prepare a submission that we sent in. So they'll review that and include that as part of their study. And we encouraged our supporters to do the same. And if you want to read that HUMA brief that we sent in, it is on our website as well. I don't know if Kaylee can throw that in the chat. And I know someone in the chat had mentioned they would like to take note of some of the data that we've talked about in this presentation, and some of that is in our HUMA submission, so you can maybe pull that from there. Yeah, so in general, you can learn more about all of the actions that we have been taking on our website. If you go under the milestones tab will provide a little bit of an update around everything that we have been getting up to. I think we are turning it over to Catherine now to speak to what was in budget 2024 and how that relates to what we are asking for in our call to action.
I don't see Catherine, so maybe just go ahead.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I can do these slides. So maybe just jump to the next slide. So basically, I think, you know, we've all heard in the media, and the government certainly made a lot of announcements around significant investments in housing in this federal budget 2024. And so there was a lot of discussion around housing at the time that the budget was released and leading up to it. But we really wanted to drill down to see exactly who the housing that this budget is investing in is going to be affordable to, because of course we, you know, as Shauna mentioned, are very focused on meeting the housing needs of those with the lowest incomes. And so when you really look at what is in the budget that is targeted at the type of social housing that we are calling for, right, non-market housing, where rents are geared to income, there is really only one place where the federal government announced an investment, and that is within an existing program called the Affordable Housing Fund. And they announced $1 billion within that fund specifically for a rapid housing stream. So this rapid housing stream is a program that has existed over the past few years. So the federal government has made very small amount of investments in this before. And based on previous rounds of this stream, we expect that $1 billion that's in this year's federal budget to only produce 5,000 units over several years. And so when we look at that in the context of what the SHHR campaign is asking for, that's really only going to meet 1% of the total need across the country. So that is a super inadequate investment. And that, again, is the only place where we see an investment specifically targeted for social housing. We also want to note that there was an announcement for a $1.5 million rental protection fund. This is a fund that's going to help nonprofits and other partners, so it may not be limited to the non-market sector, to acquire and preserve existing affordable housing units. And we put quote unquote affordable there because there's nothing in there that will ensure that the housing that is acquired through this fund will be affordable to the lowest income households. So there's no criteria or requirement right now that we know of that will ensure that. And what we know it will need is to make those housing units through this fund at that rent geared to income level that Shauna was talking about, that we're going to need other levels of government, whether it's provinces or municipalities, to partner with those who are using this fund to provide those ongoing operating subsidies that providers need in order to charge those really low rents that we are after. So the rental protection fund is a really positive step because we do need to be able to have nonprofit partners acquire existing affordable housing units that are at risk of being lost. But we need other levels of government to partner with this strategy in order to make those units affordable to the lowest income households. And then the other piece we want to highlight is that the budget announced plans to use public land and public buildings to help reduce the cost of developing new homes. But again, it's not geared specifically to non-market housing providers, and that is obviously something we want to see. So I think we can go to the next slide. The last piece there on this slide is just focusing again on how all of those initiatives are really going to require other levels of government to partner to bring in those ongoing operating subsidies to be able to achieve the rent geared to income units. So when you look at the budget's housing investments in total, the vast majority of expenditures are going towards creating housing that's privately owned, so not non-market, and that will be unaffordable to the lowest income households. So for example, there's a $15 billion announcement going to the apartment construction loan program This is the largest program in the National Housing Strategy, and it primarily goes to private housing providers. And we've given the example here where this program produced a building in Winnipeg where the average affordable rents were over $2,000 per month. So this is actually even higher than the average market rent in Winnipeg, and very obviously out of reach for the folks that we are trying to target housing for. So we'll just jump to the next slide. So yeah, so we clearly need a shift in where our federal housing investments are going. And we need your help to do that. But there's opportunity, right? So we want to see the money that is going towards market housing right now be redirected towards the type of rent geared to income housing units that we're calling for. That $1.5 billion rental protection fund, we want to see that reclassified so that it is targeted only for non-market housing providers to acquire units, and that it's targeted at providing those rent geared to income rents as opposed to the more expensive affordable rents. And then finally, for the government's plans to set aside land and buildings for housing, we want that to be set aside only for non-market housing providers so they can develop rent geared to income housing. So that's the part. We're going to be focusing on advancing and advocating for our call to action that Shauna outlined. But these are some specific asks that we are going to be making of the federal government based on what they've already announced in the budget and how they can sort of shift announcements they've already made to better meet the needs of the folks that we are targeting. Next slide. Okay, so now it's back to what was going to be me. So I'll keep going. I'll just pause for a second though, in case there's anything I need to flag because I haven't been following the chat. Good to keep going. Okay, so I'll just tell you briefly what our next steps are over the coming year. We're planning to continue to engage with national media. So we really want to get national media as much as possible talking about social housing in the way that our campaign is defining it, and covering, what it is that we're calling for and where we want to see federal investments going. We're also going to be doing more work to continue to engage politicians, so particularly our federal MPs, but also the various political parties at the national level. We know we have an election coming up not too far off in the future, and so we definitely want to get on party radar. And we want to be engaging other levels of government because it's important that our provinces and municipalities across the country are also joining our advocacy calls to the federal government. We want to be working to strengthen our alignment with other national advocates. So, there are other groups that are organizing and advocating around housing at the federal level in different ways and around different things. But I think often we do have a lot of the same goals. And so we want to be connecting with them over the coming year to ensure that we are aligned when it comes to what we are calling for around social housing. We're also going to be looking to fill roles on our organizing committee. So we have a group of individuals, some who represent organizations, some are just individuals who meet regularly to plan our campaigns and to do the work to make all of our actions happen. So that's something we'll continue to do. We're going to continue to promote our national letter writing campaign, which targets federal cabinet ministers. We're going to continue to try to build up our number of endorsements for our call to action. And then finally, what we really want to focus on the rest of this webinar is how we can build the capacity of SHHR supporters to be able to organize and advocate more effectively from their local communities and sort of join us in what we're trying to do at the national level. So we'll go to the next slide. we want to talk just a little bit about what you can do. And I think there are two things that you could do right now. There we go. So if you use the QR code at the top, that is one that will allow you to go in and endorse the campaign. While you do that, there's an option to subscribe to our newsletter. And I really want to encourage you to do both because our newsletter is where you get the chance to stay informed around what we're doing and know when there's an opportunity for you to take action to help move this campaign forward. And that's really the most, like one of the most critical pieces of making this campaign work is that we have people across the country that are participating in these actions and showing our decision makers in the federal government that this is something that matters to people across the country. So it's great if you can do that. And then the bottom QR code is also something you can do right now. It's our letter writing campaign. So it'll take you to our website where you can fill out some information that will send a letter directly to Cabinet. And just ask you to be patient with us because we're in transitioning our platforms for this type of advocacy tool right now. And so we're using a temporary tool. It may not work for you. If it doesn't work for you, we've created some language in a template that you can just copy and paste and put right into your own email and just fire that off to the email list that we provided. So those are two things that we'd love for you all to do right now. And then if we jump to the next slide, other actions that you can take kind of going forward to support us are things like meeting with your local MPs or your local governments, whether it's a municipality or the province, to encourage them to endorse the SHHR campaign. You can organize local events in your community to raise awareness about this campaign and how people there can support it. You can engage your own local media to cover social housing and our campaign asks. You can share our campaign information on your social media. And we're hoping that you will have other ideas around things that you can do in your own community to support this. And that's what you're going to be able to share right away when we jump out into breakout groups. So that's kind of the end of our presentation piece. I'm just going to explain how the breakout groups are going to work. It looks like we're a bit ahead of time, so that's great. I'll pause before I do that, though, again, in case I missed something in the chat that we need to address before we do this.
I think we're good, Kirsten.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so Kim is going to break us out into groups by region because we thought it would be really helpful for folks to be able to connect with other people that are either in their community or nearby, so that it would make it a little bit easier for you to talk about how to organize from your local communities with others in that community. And we just really want to learn how you would see yourself being involved in this campaign from where you are, and importantly, how we as a campaign organizing committee can support you to do that advocacy from your local communities. So I think Kaylee's going to put a link to a form in the chat that you can open up. We'll give you access to that as well once you break out into your groups. This is something that we want you to just fill out towards the end of your breakout group discussion, just so that we can really have on paper information from you around how you'd like to be involved and how we can support that just in writing so we can follow up more easily. But it'll be good to fill that out at the end of your discussion once you have a better sense of maybe how you would answer those questions. And the 4 questions that we're going to focus on in the breakout groups are right up here on the slide. So we want to know how you can support our next steps from your community, right? So whether that's engaging your own local media, getting endorsements from local MPs, governments, or maybe joining our organizing committee. And then we want to hear about other steps that you can take that you are interested in doing, that you feel like you have the skills or the capacity within your community to get done. So Maybe that's organizing an event, or maybe, you know, you have access to a great email list in some group you're involved in, and you can share you know, information about our campaign to that group, or encourage people to sign on and endorse. Whatever ideas you have, we want to hear them. And then we really want to hear how we can support you to take those actions. So we're wondering if there are tools that we can provide, or maybe trainings that we can offer. Could be around how to work with media, how to write op-eds or press releases, or maybe it's how to connect with politicians. So, you know, making meeting requests, or how to prepare for those meetings, follow up from those meetings. Whatever it is, because we're thinking that we might be able to offer some webinars in the future where we can focus in on providing some of those tools and training that people are interested in getting. And then finally, we want to talk about, you know, what organizing capacity already exists in your community that we can help you build upon. So it's helpful for us to know, you know, if you're kind of starting from scratch, where you and maybe a few others in your community really want to get involved in doing some organizing around housing, but there is no kind of group set up and you're sort of just getting started. We want to know that and see how we can help you build that up. But we also want to know if there are existing groups and who those are, and so that we can link up with them and see how we might be able to align and work together. So those will be the 4 questions. I think we're ready to break out. If Kim, if you're ready to do that.
But we're going to start by just inviting the groups to just provide us with a little bit of a summary of, you know, some highlights of your conversation, whatever you want to report. Okay, so let's start with the East Coast.
All right. I can sort of introduce our conversation. I'll start with one of the things that came up was there wasn't much, or there isn't much in terms of participation from Quebec that already exists. And this creates a broader issue where the language barrier, getting materials translated into French, becomes even a larger issue when you don't have anybody around who's able to do that work. So that's going to be an issue going forward, and we need to make sure that campaign materials are accessible in French. One of the other ideas that came up in terms of getting the word out, there's a lot of focus on traditional media, and there's naturally some limits to that. So David brought up the idea of starting a podcast to get the word out and to speak with people who are advocating for this across the country and talk about the campaign and social housing and that sort of stuff. It would open us up to a new and a different audience, I believe. Also, I think that pretty much everybody involved agreed that having a webinar or some form of training to do media, like media training, and then also broader community outreach. So when we're advocating within the community and talking to folks in that, sort of having a little bit of training on how to do that would be helpful.
Okay, great. Anything else?
Anybody else wants to add anything? That's my recap.
Okay, thank you, Corey.
Great.
So Quebec, I see you're here, Catherine. I don't remember how, was there
We're
any
on the
other-
East Coast.
Oh, so you were combined with East Coast. Okay.
Yep.
Then we're gonna go to Ontario. Did we have 1 or 2 groups there? Just one? One.
Yeah,
Okay.
we just had one group,
Okay.
and we had an awesome discussion. Lots of conversation about interest in having more information about co-ops and land trusts and how folks can start to take these initiatives in their communities. And there was a lot of really good mutual aid, helping provide information to folks who are trying to start these processes. And I think the conversation was really good to really dig into, how can we make sure that the rubber is meeting the road when we're talking about realizing human rights, when we're talking about getting people into housing now in the short term, while we also focus on these big advocacy goals. There was also a really good conversation about trying to make sure that funding and policy realities actually like align with what's happening in municipalities and to help close some of those gaps. And then also talking about some of the things that are happening in remote, rural, also First Nation communities, and making sure that when we're talking about housing and providing good quality housing for people, it also reflects people's kind of whole lived realities. Also talking about, support for narrowing gaps in access to like energy and utilities. And I think, it was a really robust conversation. So there's lots of points that I didn't get to. We also talked about some successes. Jess in Ontario, who's successfully fought an N12 eviction order. So there are lots of wins to look to in addition to all of the tough things that are happening with housing. So great conversation, and please, anyone feel free to add anything I missed.
I think there was a couple of points made by Bill. It was that that the campaign should also include either some language or an action around the preservation of rent geared to income housing that is already existing, as we see that seems to be actually a precursor to most of the situations we're dealing with in our community around the lack of affordable housing. Is it's being swallowed up by the private sector. And then also he mentioned that can be, again, part of the campaign, and the ask is to go to the federal government around a funding. And I think Joan would mention that around specifically an acquisition strategy in order to ensure that housing that may be on the cusp of being swallowed up by the private sector, that there's a pot of money there available for not-for-profits, co-ops, or other sort of rent geared to income housing providers to access those assets. I don't know if that was everything.
Just to add to that, it wasn't just preservation of non-market housing that we might lose, but also preservation of still affordable market housing, so that we preserve tenancies as well as providing the opportunity to preserve buildings. But Joan was emphasizing that we can buy buildings and preserve or even expand affordable housing much quicker than we can build, and it's really important to secure those before the next federal election.
Yeah,
that's something that can move quickly.
Yeah, acquisition is
okay. Joan, did you want to quickly say? I just want to emphasize that our second call to action is very specifically around acquisition. So and we do actually also make the case that it's about expansion and maintenance of supply, but again, specific to social housing. But Joan, did you want to say something before I move on to the next group?
Yeah, I think the other thing is that it's much cheaper. It's much cheaper to buy existing housing, even if it's in good shape or even if you have to refurbish it, than it is to start from scratch and build, just because there's been so much speculation in land in all of the major cities that alone will hold you back. And also the developers and the big construction companies claim really inflated costs for building anything.
Okay, thanks, Joan. So I'm going to move on to just watching the time, to the prairies.
Megan, I asked you right before we got pulled back if you wanted to share. I didn't get your answer, so I don't want to jump in.
Yeah.
Did you want me to do that?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I'm sorry. I can share a little bit about what we discussed, and then if I miss anything and you want, or if you want to add more feedback on top of it, feel free to. I know we don't have a lot of time, so so basically, like in our the prairie group, there's a lot of curiosity. Different participants want to learn how to better collaborate with others. Find out what strategies are being implemented, across the country. There was discussion regarding skill sharing sessions for future webinars and how we can incorporate that. Leadership development as well. Discussions around the media, and really, kind of like setting the foundation for like how we're going to move forward to incorporate our campaign at a federal level, and then how we can better support others within within our cities, and I mean within our provinces as well.
Maybe if I could just jump in there. This is Ann Landry from Calgary, and really echoing Bill, who's just saying stop the loss of market as well as non-market. Absolutely. We need to get, we need to summons to the House of Commons Human Committee, the largest financialized landlords in Canada, to look at their cost structure and profits, and to get a national rent freeze and eviction freeze, and to lower rent gouge rents. We saw Starlight at Huma was requested twice. We need to step it up right now. Everybody ask to get them compelled. And we will need for that purchase strategy that a lot of human rights organizations as well as the industry has requested. We need to definitely understand their costs, operating capital, all those costs, and bring it down from the rent gouge levels, because we're at 1,800 for a single bedroom when the LEMR tool from the Canadian Centre for Housing Rights says that one bedroom here in Calgary should be 1,050. So we've got to lower those rents. And then also we need immediately, and I mean immediately, a national rent freeze and eviction freeze. We can all get on that today. We can ask the House of Commons Human Committee right now. We can ask Prime Minister Trudeau right now, today. That's something you can all do today, because you've probably hearing about the catastrophic rent increases here in Calgary. Thanks very much for holding this. Okay, and also just to let you know, I have a campaign that I've requested the City of Calgary Council, the Housing Assessment Resource Tool. It addresses social housing as well as market, but we need 50,000 at 1,262 here. Anybody can look at the Housing Assessment Resource Tool. I think it's a blend of both your strategies that you could probably consider to get everybody across the country. You can use the QR code right there to get some background information that I have at the City of Calgary Council website. Thanks very much. Okay.
Thanks, Anne. You could also send that information to Kaylee if you like. Okay, we've got one group left, and Saida, do you want to? I was taking notes, but I think you can sort of sum it up really quickly for us. I think we're the only two left from our group.
Sure. Sorry, I'm just swallowing.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay. I'll real quick. We were in the BC area. A few things that came up was there's a lot of interest to participate in the campaign. Things that would be helpful are templates to write to different kinds of officials, making sure it's short and sweet and not too long and with a really clear ask. Tools for responding to NIMBYism, because that usually couples some of the work that they're doing locally. Research and kind of like executive summaries of research that can, if we're coming across stuff, how do people not have to keep reinventing the wheel, but just getting quick summaries of data. And also, there's a willingness and interest in being able to talk to local MLAs and that kind of thing about the campaign and about the work, and to generate some support municipally in their local communities. And also an invitation to ask if someone from social housing and human rights can come speak to their coalitions to raise awareness about it locally and to kind of build more support amongst their member organizations.
Great, thanks, Ada. So we've got 1 minute left. I'm just going to again remind people to complete the form that we gave you to tell us how you'd like to be involved. We're going to review all the notes, and anything that we didn't respond to, we will get back to people on that as soon as possible. And I just wanted to thank everybody for joining the organizing committee, but especially Kimberly and Kaylee for looking after all the logistics. And you know, these things can be a challenge as we've learned, but it's great that everybody just kind of goes with the flow. So appreciated that. So I think with that, we will end this session, and you know how to reach us, but we'll also be in touch with folks with sort of a summary of what happened today. So thanks all.